The words in the message were not the words of a formal operational communication. Formal operational communications between American and British command elements during the combined campaign had a specific register, a professional and institutional language that had been developed across years of combined operations into something that conveyed urgency without losing the precision that urgency in operational contexts required. The message that arrived at the British Task Force headquarters in the early hours of a morning in the third year of the combined campaign was not in that register. It was in the register of a senior American officer who had run out of formal language and had written what he needed to say in the words the situation demanded rather than the words the institutional framework would have preferred. The message said, "Stop them," 2 words. And then, because 2 words were apparently not sufficient to convey the full weight of what was being communicated, 2 more. "Please," 4 words. From a 2-star American general to the commanding officer of the British Special Forces Task Force in the operational area. 4 words that the people who have described the message in the years since its transmission have described consistently as the most direct communication they observed pass between senior commanders at that level during the entire duration of the combined campaign. Not the most urgent. Urgent communications were routine in the operational environment the combined campaign occupied. The most direct. The 4 words had no diplomatic cushioning and no institutional framework and no careful professional language designed to convey a request while preserving the operational relationship between the 2 commands. They had the specific directness of a man who had assessed the situation and concluded that the situation required exactly 4 words and not 1 more. The situation required the 4 words because the SAS element had been on the operation for 6 hours, and in those 6 hours had done what the American command had assessed as impossible when the operation began and had then continued doing it. And the continuation was the problem. The impossibility had been the basis for the American command's own operational planning in the area for the preceding 3 months. The planning had been built on an intelligence assessment that established, with a confidence level the American command's analytical team had described as among the highest they had assigned to an assessment in the operational area, that the network the SAS element was currently dismantling could not be dismantled by the force the SAS element represented in the time the operational window provided. The assessment was not wrong about the network. The assessment was wrong about the force. The 3 months of American planning that the assessment had supported had produced a concept of operations for addressing the network that required a force considerably larger than the SAS element, supported by an intelligence and aviation and logistics architecture considerably more substantial than what the SAS element was operating with, executing across a timeline considerably longer than the 6 hours the SAS element had been operating for. The concept of operations had not yet been approved for execution. The approval process was in its final stages when the SAS element launched on an operation against the same network that the American concept of operations had been designed to address, and the SAS element's launch had not been coordinated with the American command's planning process in a way that would have allowed the American command to advise on the timing or the approach before the operation was underway. The SAS element had not launched without coordination, in the sense of having ignored or bypassed the coordination processes that governed combined operations in the area. It had launched on the basis of intelligence that it had received through its own collection channels against a target that its own analytical framework had assessed as actionable on the timeline the intelligence specified, and it had notified the relevant American command elements through the established notification protocols at the moment the operation launched. The notification was received. The American command acknowledged it. The American command then watched the operation develop across the first 6 hours, and the watching produced the 4 words. The watching was through the intelligence feeds that the combined architecture made available to American command elements monitoring partner force operations in the area, and the feeds were showing things that the American command's operational planners were comparing against the intelligence assessment that the concept of operations had been built on, and the comparison was producing a widening gap between what the assessment had said was possible for a force of the SAS element size and what the feeds were showing the force of the SAS element size doing. The gap was the operational reality of the SAS element in the field measured against the planning assumptions that the American intelligence assessment had provided, and the gap was widening with each hour of the operation and each feed update that arrived at the American command's operations center. The specific content of the first 6 hours has never been fully described in any accessible public source. The operational reporting from the SAS element during those hours is in the combined operational archive at the classification level that the combined campaign applied to high-sensitivity direct action reporting, and the feed footage that the American command was monitoring is in the American operational archive at the equivalent level. What is accessible through the accounts of people who were in the American command's operations center during those 6 hours is the shape of what the feeds were showing and the shape of what the shape was doing to the people who were watching it. The operations center had a senior planning officer on duty, whose position gave him visibility of the combined operational picture across the area. He has been described by the people who were in the operations center during the 6 hours in terms that are consistent across independent accounts. He was not a man who was easily disturbed by operational developments. He had been in the operations center through situations that had produced the specific kind of sustained urgency that operations centers in active combat environments generated regularly, and he had managed those situations with the professional composure that his position required and that his operational background had developed. The 6 hours disturbed him, not gradually, in the way that a situation develops across hours into something that eventually produces concern. From the first feed update of the second hour, which showed the SAS element's position relative to the network's defensive architecture, and showed it in a position that the planning assessment had described as unachievable for a force of that size without the support architecture the concept of operations required. He called the general at the end of the second hour. The call has been described by the two people who were present for the general side of it in terms that confirm its substance without providing its precise wording. The planning officer described what the feeds were showing. The general asked how many operators the SAS element had on the ground. The planning officer gave the number. The general was quiet for a moment that the people present described as a moment of processing rather than a moment of doubt, because the general was not a man who doubted, and the quietness was the quietness of a man absorbing information that required more than an instant to integrate into his operational picture. Then the general asked how long they had been in. The planning officer said 2 hours. The general asked where the concept of operations was in the approval process. The planning officer told him. The general said he would call back. The general called the British Task Force headquarters instead. The account of that call that the sources who have described it provide is consistent in establishing that the call was an attempt to understand the operational picture from the British side before the general made any decisions about what the American command's response to what the feeds were showing should be. The British Task Force commanding officer described the operation in terms that the general found consistent with what the feeds were showing and inconsistent with what the American planning assessment had described as possible. The conversation between the two senior officers has been described by sources adjacent to both as a conversation in which two professional commanders were engaged in the specific kind of bilateral communication that the combined campaign's operational relationship enabled and required, in which information was shared directly and honestly, and in which neither commander was attempting to manage the other's perception of what the operation was producing. What the operation was producing, as the third and fourth hours unfolded and the feeds continued to update, was the systematic dismantling of a network architecture that the American concept of operations had calculated would require 3 to 4 times the force the SAS element represented, and a planning and execution timeline of several days rather than the hours the element had been operating for. The dismantling was not complete at the end of the 4th hour. It was further along than the American planning assessment had described as the achievable progress for a force of that size in that time, and it was continuing, and the continuation was the source of the problem that the 4 words were eventually written to address. The problem was not the dismantling. The American command had no objection to the dismantling and was not attempting to prevent it. The problem was the operational position the SAS element was moving into as the dismantling continued, and the operational position was a problem because the American planning assessment's description of the network's defensive architecture included a specific assessment of the force that architecture could generate in response to sustained pressure against its outer nodes, and the assessment of the response force was an assessment that the SAS element's size and support profile was not designed to manage without the aviation and fire support and quick reaction force architecture that the concept of operations had included, and that the SAS element was operating without. The American command's concern was not that the SAS element was incompetent to manage what it was facing. The concern was that the network's response to what the element was doing would be a response calibrated to the network's assessment of what it was facing, and the network's assessment of what it was facing would be based on what it could observe of the force that was dismantling its outer nodes, and what it could observe was a force that appeared from the network's observation position to be small enough to be surrounded and destroyed if a sufficient response force could be assembled and positioned before the element extracted. The network was in the process of assembling and positioning that response force. The feeds were showing this. The fifth hour was when the general began to understand the full shape of what the feeds were describing. The network's response force was assembling at a pace that the American planning assessment had modeled for exactly this scenario, and the modeled response was a response that the concept of operations had been designed to address through the weight of the American force structure and the aviation and fire support assets the concept included. The SAS element had none of those assets. The general called the British Task Force headquarters again. The second call was shorter than the first. The general described what the feeds were showing regarding the network's response force. The British Task Force commanding officer said he was aware. The general asked what the SAS element's extraction plan was. The British commanding officer provided the outline. The general said he was prepared to provide aviation support for the extraction if the British element required it. The British commanding officer said he would relay the offer to the patrol commander. The sixth hour was the hour the general wrote the 4 words. The feeds were showing the network's response force in a position that the American planning assessment described as the position from which an assault on the SAS element's location was possible, and the timing of the response force's movement was consistent with a response that the network's command had calculated would be executed before the element could extract through the routes the British commanding officer had described. The general did not have the authority to order the SAS element to extract. He did not have the authority to direct the British Task Force commanding officer's operational decisions regarding the element. He had the authority to communicate his assessment to the British command and to request a specific action on the basis of that assessment. And the specific action he was requesting was that the element be ordered to extract before the network's response force reached the position from which the American planning assessment said an assault was survivable only with the aviation and fire support that the concept of operations included, and that the element was operating without. The message he sent was the message that the situation required after the assessment of what the formal language available to him could carry and what it could not. The formal language could carry an operational assessment and a recommendation and a request for the British command to consider the American command's assessment in its decision-making regarding the element's extraction. The formal language could not carry what the general needed to communicate in the time he had to communicate it, which was the specific and direct statement that the element needed to extract now, and that the American command's assessment of what would happen if it did not extract now was an assessment that the American command was not willing to be responsible for in any form that the formal language would have produced. The formal language was too slow and too indirect for what the feeds were showing and what the 6th hour required. The 4 words were what the 6th hour required. The British Task Force commanding officer received the 4 words. The account of his response that the sources who have described it provide is consistent in the following. He read the message, he contacted the patrol commander, and he relayed the American command's assessment and the offer of aviation support for the extraction. The patrol commander's response to the message has been described in the accounts of people who were in the task force headquarters when the response arrived in consistent terms. The patrol commander said he was aware of the response force's position. He said the extraction plan accounted for it. He said he did not require aviation support. He said the operation would be complete in 40 minutes and the extraction would follow. The general received the patrol commander's response through the British command's relay and read it in the operations center in the presence of the planning officer and 2 other staff who have described the moment in consistent terms. He read it twice, he set it down, he looked at the feeds for a moment, then he told the planning officer to have the aviation assets ready for a non-standard extraction request and to ensure the quick reaction force was staged at a position that could reach the element's extraction route in the time the response force's movement allowed. The planning officer confirmed. The general watched the feeds. The 40 minutes produced the outcome the patrol commander had described. The extraction was complete within the time frame. The network's response force reached the position from which the American planning assessment had described an assault as executable 17 minutes after the element cleared the operational area. The feeds showed the response force arriving at a location that the element had vacated 17 minutes earlier. The operations center was quiet in the way that operations centers are quiet when the development they have been managing does not produce the outcome that the management was designed to prevent. The general watched the feed showing the network's response force at the vacated location for a moment. Then he asked for the full operational reporting from the British element when it became available. The reporting arrived 4 hours later and was reviewed at the American command level and produced. According to the sources who have described the review, a sustained internal reassessment of the intelligence analysis that had supported the concept of operations, specifically the section of the analysis that had established what a force of the SAS element size could achieve against the network in the operational window. The reassessment was not a formal review process. It was the specific kind of internal recalibration that operational reality produces in intelligence analysis organizations when the operational reality is inconsistent with what the analysis predicted. The concept of operations was subsequently revised. The revision incorporated what the 6 hours had demonstrated about the network's defensive architecture and about the force required to operate against it. The revision reduced the estimated force requirement and shortened the estimated timeline and modified the aviation and fire support architecture based on what the SAS element had demonstrated was achievable without those assets. The revision was not described in the combined record as having been informed by what the SAS element had done during the 6 hours. It was described as incorporating updated intelligence and revised operational analysis. The updated intelligence was the operational reporting from the 6 hours. The revised operational analysis was the recalibration the 6 hours had produced. The 4 words are in the Combined Communications Archive at the classification level that operational communications between senior commanders during the combined campaign sat at. They are in the archive alongside the feeds they were written in response to, and the patrol commander's reply, and the general's subsequent communications, and the revised concept of operations, and the operational reporting that informed the revision. The archive holds all of it at the level the classification requires. The people whose clearances give them access to the level can read the 4 words in the context of everything the 6 hours produced. The people whose clearances do not give them access to that level cannot. What the people who were in the operations center that night have said in the careful and partial accounts that constitute the partial public record of what the 6 hours contained is consistent in describing the 4 words as the most direct communication they observed pass between senior commanders at that level during the combined campaign, and consistent in describing the outcome of the 4 words as an outcome that the general watched arrive on the feeds 17 minutes after the element had already extracted, and that he received in the specific silence of a man who had written the most direct communication of his career in the 6th hour of an operation, and whose operational assessment had been correct about the network's response and incorrect about whether the patrol commander's extraction plan could account for it before the response reached the position the American planning assessment had described as the one from which an assault was executable. The planning assessment had been wrong about what the patrol commander could account for. The general had written the 4 words because he trusted the planning assessment. The patrol commander had replied with 40 minutes because he trusted his operators and his plan, and the 3 days of close observation that had produced the plan, and the decades of institutional experience that had produced the operators. Both men had been correct in trusting what they trusted. The general had been correct that the network's response force would reach the assault position in the window the assessment described. The patrol commander had been correct that the extraction would be complete before the window closed. The difference between those 2 correct assessments was 17 minutes, and the feeds confirmed it, and the operations center sat in the specific silence of a room where the feeds have just confirmed that the 4 words were necessary, and the outcome they were written to prevent did not occur. The general has not publicly described the 4 words, or the 6 hours, or the feeds, or the silence. The combined operations record contains the 4 words, and the 6 hours, and the feeds and the silence at the classification level where the combined campaign held things it had decided the public record was not prepared to contain. The SAS element came back. The network's response force stood at a vacated location on the feeds. The concept of operations was revised. The 4 words remained in the archive where the classification placed them, available to the people whose clearances reached the level and inaccessible to the people whose clearances did not, and to the public record that the combined campaign produced and maintained, and that does not contain the night a 2-star American general wrote 4 words to a British commanding officer and meant every one of them. The bilateral operational relationship that had produced the 4 words continued after the night they were written. Both commands had understood from the beginning of the combined campaign that the relationship was larger than any single operation, and that the operations produced by the relationship were the measure of its value, and that the measure included operations like the 6 hours and the 4 words and the 17 minutes, and the silence in the operations center when the feeds confirmed the element had extracted before the response force arrived. The relationship absorbed all of it in the way that functional bilateral relationships absorb the operational developments that test them, which was by continuing and by incorporating what the developments had demonstrated into the planning and the coordination and the mutual understanding that the relationship was built on. The mutual understanding that the 6 hours and the 4 words added to the bilateral relationship was the specific and concrete understanding that the American planning assessment's description of what the SAS element was capable of in the operational environment had been incorrect in a direction that the American command's subsequent planning would need to account for. The accounting took the form of the concept of operations revision and the internal recalibration of the intelligence analysis and the specific adjustment to the American command's assessment framework that the 6 hours had made necessary. The adjustment was not described in the combined record as an adjustment. It was described as updated analysis incorporating recent operational data. The recent operational data was the 6 hours. The update was the recalibration the 6 hours had produced. The general who wrote the 4 words has not described the night publicly. His former staff have described their recollections of the operations center during the 6 hours in the careful and partial terms that people use when they are describing things they know from their service, that the institutional constraints of their former service continue to govern. The descriptions are consistent in their account of the operations center's atmosphere during the 6th hour, and the general's composure during it, and the 4 words and the patrol commander's reply, and the 40 minutes and the feeds and the silence. The consistency is the consistency of accurate memory applied to a night that the people who were present found distinctive enough in the combined campaign's operational history to remember precisely. The network that the SAS element dismantled during the 6 hours has been described in the combined operational reporting that covers the subsequent period as having been degraded in a manner that the network's subsequent operational activity confirmed. The degradation is in the record at the standard distribution level as an operational outcome attributable to the combined campaign's targeting activities in the area. The specific operation that produced the degradation is in the record at the classification level. The 4 words that were written in the 6th hour of the operation are in the communications archive alongside the operation. The patrol commander's reply is there. The feeds are there. The 17 minutes between the element's extraction and the response force's arrival at the vacated location is there. The archive holds the night and everything the night contained at the classification level that the combined campaign applied to the operations and communications it assessed as requiring that level. The people whose clearances reach the level can read the 4 words in the context of everything the archive holds about the night. The people whose clearances do not reach the level know the 4 words through the partial public record that the accounts of people who were present have produced, which holds the shape of the 4 words and the shape of the night without the complete account that the classification keeps in the archive where the shape came from. The shape is the 4 words, and the 6 hours, and the 40 minutes, and the 17 minutes, and the silence in the operations center, and the feeds showing the network's response force at a location the element had vacated 17 minutes before the response force arrived. The shape is visible in the accounts of the people who were there, and in the partial record those accounts have produced, and in the understanding that the shape conveys about what the night was and what the 4 words meant, and what the American general understood about the SAS element and its patrol commander, that the 4 words were written to prevent from becoming something the combined record would have been required to hold in a different form from the form the archive holds it in. The 4 words prevented that different form. The patrol commander's reply and the 40 minutes and the 17 minutes completed the prevention. The archive holds the night at its classification level. The combined record does not hold the night in the accessible form that the 4 words were written to prevent it from requiring. The bilateral relationship continued. The general returned to his command. The patrol commander extracted. The feeds confirmed it. The operations center held the silence that the confirmation produced. The archive holds the silence too, in the space between the feeds and the subsequent communications, in the record of a night when a senior American commander wrote 4 words to a British commanding officer, and the British patrol commander replied with 40 minutes and was right by 17. The intelligence assessment that the American concept of operations had been built on was a product of the analytical process that the combined intelligence architecture applied to high-priority network targets in the operational area, and the analytical process was rigorous and professional, and had produced assessments across the combined campaign that the operational record had consistently validated. The specific section of the assessment that the 6 hours had revised was the section that addressed what a direct action force of the SAS element size could achieve against the network's defensive architecture in the operational window. The revision the 6 hours produced was not a revision of the network's defensive architecture which the assessment had described accurately. It was a revision of the assessment's model of what the SAS element represented as a direct action force, and the revision was in the direction of the model having significantly underestimated that representation. The underestimation was not unique to this assessment. The American intelligence analytical framework that produced the model had been calibrated against the performance data of American direct action forces, because American direct action forces were the primary reference population the framework had been developed against, and the framework therefore produced models that were accurate representations of what American direct action forces could achieve, and that were not accurate representations of what SAS elements could achieve when the SAS elements were operating within the specific capability parameters that the regiment's training and selection and operational experience produced. The 6 hours was the specific operational event that made this calibration gap visible to the American command in the most direct form it had taken in the combined campaign's history, which was the form of a 2-star general writing 4 words to a British commanding officer in the 6th hour of an operation whose outcome the general's own intelligence assessment had described as unachievable for a force of the element's size. The calibration gap is in the revised concept of operations in the form of the updated force requirement and timeline and support architecture that the revision produced. The revision is in the combined record at the standard distribution level as an operational planning update. The 6 hours that produce the revision are in the combined record at the classification level. The 4 words are in the communications archive alongside the 6 hours. The calibration gap that the 4 words made visible is in the revised planning document as the adjustment the 6 hours required the framework to make. The adjustment is the record of what the 4 words meant in operational planning terms, translated from the direct language of a senior commander writing in the 6th hour of an operation into the professional language of planning documents and analytical frameworks and force requirement calculations. The translation is accurate. It preserves the substance of what the 4 words communicated about the gap between what the American planning framework had modeled and what the SAS element had demonstrated. It does not preserve the directness of the 4 words, which was the directness of a man who had been watching the feeds for 6 hours and who had concluded that the situation required 4 words and not the professional language that the planning documents and analytical frameworks and force requirement calculations used. The 4 words were the direct form of what the planning revision was the translated form of, and the direct form is in the communications archive and the translated form is in the planning record, and both forms of the same information are in the combined record at their respective levels, and both are accessible to the people whose clearances reach those levels and inaccessible in their full form to the people whose clearances do not. The partial public record holds the shape of both forms, the shape of the 4 words and the shape of the planning revision, without the full content of either, and the shape of the 4 words is what this account holds, and what the accounts of the people who were in the operations center that night have produced in the partial and careful register of people who know what they can say and who have said it. The general watched the feeds for 17 minutes after writing the 4 words and receiving the patrol commander's reply. The feeds showed the element extract. The feeds showed the network's response force move to the position from which the American planning assessment had described an assault as executable. The feeds showed the response force arrive at a location that held nothing of what the response force had come to destroy. The general watched this and then told the planning officer to stand down the aviation assets and the quick reaction force and to begin processing the operational reporting when it arrived from the British element. The planning officer confirmed. The operations center resumed the pace of its normal operational monitoring. The general left for the night. The 4 words are in the archive. The silence after the 17th minute is in the archive in the form of the absence of subsequent urgent communications between the American and British commands. The revised concept of operations is in the planning record. The bilateral relationship continued. The network was degraded in the form the 6 hours had produced, and the subsequent operations had extended. The archive holds the complete account of the night at its classification level, and the partial public record holds the shape, and the shape holds the 4 words, and the 4 words hold the night.